When is Meta Mondays? I'm gonna do it tomorrow, basically. So today we have patch notes, right? The thing is, it's not just me being lazy or me being late or me procrastinating or me staying up like last night too long and playing video games and then forgetting that it was actually Sunday. In reality, what it is the patch notes got announced on Monday. So in reality, I can't really do the Meta Monday until we've seen the patch notes. So obviously, therefore, I do have to delay it. I mean, there's no other option, right? Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and we're back for another episode of Meta Mondays. This is a particularly exciting episode because, of course, we have the new patch balance notes that's going to change quite a bit, at least short term. I do expect long term. They're kind of adding a lot of fun things. I do expect none of the decks will have super crazy major shifts upwards or downwards. However, it's definitely going to make things very, very interesting in this upcoming week. I did make a video going over my thoughts on each of the individual balance changes. If you want to check that out, it's somewhere here on the channel. Anyway, we're going to be getting into the Meta Mondays, and that means we're going to be going over win rate data in Masters. We're going to be talking about which decks are going to be tier 1, which decks are going to be maybe a little bit lower this week, and the data coming in from last week was actually fairly interesting, especially combined with some of the nerfs that high-level decks, like for example Bannerman, have been announced to get on, well, I would say tomorrow, but if you're listening to this, that would mean it's happened already probably. And of course, some of the nerfs coming through are going to, end up influencing the predictions. Like, for example, high-level decks like Bannerman getting nerfed is going to affect the tiering here, and we'll see how it all shakes out. But for the record, this tiering list right now is based kind of 80% off of the performances of these decks in the last week, which is mostly statistics, but not necessarily. And of course, then we've got kind of 20% semi-predictive on how things are going to look after the nerfs and the buffs all come through. Now, one last thing before we do go ahead and get started is that, as always, I am going to be linking the win rate and play rate data for you guys in the pinned comment. If you want to check it out yourself, go to town. I'm going to go ahead and stop blue ballsing you guys now and show you where the tier list is at. Now, this is a very, very, very interesting breakdown. So I'm going to take the next couple of minutes giving you the very basic rundown. I'm basically just going to talk about each deck and kind of why they're up or down. And then I'll go kind of in-depth deck by deck and talk about any changes that the individual lists might have had in their cards. And I will say, every single deck on this list has changed their list at least a little bit. At least a couple of cards are different. So we've got Carina control, Spider aggro, Kinko elusives, and Bannerman all taking up tier 1, which is somewhat of a diverse tier 1. Carina control and Spider aggro have maintained very high win rates for the past 2 weeks now, and I think that refined versions of these lists in particular, because I've gone through, it's not just the base win rate data, there's also many specific sub lists and sub variants within these, and basically the well-performing variants of these are very, very consistent, and I think they definitely deserve tier 1 spots, at least for the time being, at least until the meta shifts again. Kinko elusives has basically stabilized its normal win rate. It was very oddly, bizarrely down last week. Might have just been a weird variance blip, who knows. And Bannerman is getting a bit nerfed with the Allegiance card getting touched down. I personally suspect it'll maintain either tier 1 or high tier 2 status. I don't see this list really going anywhere, at least until the expansion, but you'll be pleased to know you will feel a little bit less worse playing against it, and you'll probably see a little bit less of them on ladder, especially for the first week. Karma Ezreal is down to tier 2, and this is because it's lost a couple of win rate points from last week. In addition to that, I think that there's going to be a lot more leeway for well-refined, aggressive decks to at least have some share in the ladder, maybe not necessarily super dominant. We will see. Anyway, that's the brief rundown of kind of the high tier decks, whether they're up or down. Now I'm going to go through deck by deck across the entire board. We're going to go through every aspect of the page here, and I want to point out I've brought back kind of like some of the tier 3 decks. I saw some of you guys in the comments were saying, you know, I wish the tier 3 decks were still around. It feels like, you know, there should be a lot more fun decks. And I've added a couple of tier 3 decks, as well as an additional kick W deck that we'll talk about later. But, you know, as you can see, there's a lot more diversity on this sheet than there was last week. And some of it is kind of like semi-fun stuff to play, while some of it actually does have some unironic potential. Anyway, now to take it from the top, Carina Control. Now this is my personal version of Carina Control, and it's doing pretty well on the win rates. Carina in general representing a 62% win rate in Masters Ladder. Well, this variant is a little bit above that at 64. And basically the idea behind this list is pretty simple. It is a full stall, full control deck. Like, absolutely, you just can't stall more than this. I'm going to enlarge my camera a little bit to just cover this tiny ad. Okay, perfect. Basically, this is just as much of a like control stall game plan as you can possibly get, right? You're seeking to just make sure you stay alive, kill all the opponent's units until you make it to turn 9, and here you're going to be starting to drop a couple bombs, mostly those being Ladros and Carina. Now, notably, we don't run 3 Carina in this version and haven't for a couple of weeks, because as nice as it is as kind of like a supplemental strategy, double drawing it isn't really important. And honestly, it's kind of like Ladros is more important as the core of the deck than Carina anyway, so it doesn't end up being like as necessary to just make sure you're drawing at any time. Bannerman is gonna like see at least a temporary dip in play rate, but Carina Control is still like well positioned against some of the more aggro decks. For example, you should be able to do very well against people playing some of the like spider aggro style things, just because you have so much removal and such efficient removal like Withering Whale. Okay, so moving right along, we have Spider Aggro. Now this is, I would say, a very, very optimized version of Spider Aggro. This is one of the lists that I've spent the most time refining compared to actually most other lists, because, you know, and you'll know if you watch my stream on Twitch, every like week or so, I'll kind of like whip this out, play it for a few games and tweak it. And this goes back all the way to basically the start of the game. I've kind of like always had Spider Aggro in the back of my mind and tweaking it as it needs to be tweaked for the current meta. And this is kind of the ultimate version that we see right now, especially on the back of a minor Draven buff. It's not really a huge buff, but he's a little bit easier to level up because you can put both Whirling Axes on him at the same time on the second attack. But even before that, I was using Draven in this deck for quite some time, actually. So let's go ahead and break down some of the changes from a lot of like kind of the more conventional style Spider Aggro lists. Well, let's talk about why Draven's in the deck. Well, he is a proactive 3-drop. Now, this is very important because Frenzied Skitterer, while it is a very valuable card in this deck, you don't always want to play it on turn 3, right? It's a very aggressive, proactive 3-drop that combos with Vision, which synergizes with your Spider Swarm game plan. Vision Draven is just like a really, really, really powerful combo, especially when you have control over the board and you've swarmed it out a good bit with like Crawling Sensations and your 1-drops and Elise. So when you go for attack with Draven on 3 and you're about to discard Vision with a Spinning Axe, that is an immense threat that your opponent will have to respect. That's going to be a really, really, really big deal, because that's the early aggression that causes this deck to win a lot of games. Then we've got kind of like the follow-up with just extra swarm tools with Brood Awakening, with Decisive Maneuver as a 2-of. That's going to be our finisher here. Now, Decisive Maneuver, as compared to other finishers, it is deniable, which is one downside, but it's an extremely high power play, especially when you have the ability to reliably swarm the board, which Brood Awakening's buff a couple of weeks ago allowed. Now, Spider's Aggro comes in on the Masters win rate at 62%, which is basically peak performance for like almost any like high play rate deck this week, and I think it's pretty well positioned to do well in the meta environment. Like, for example, if we're going to be seeing a bit more cuts to stuff like Bannerman decks, for example, which was fairly largely keeping decks like this down, this deck should do very, very well in the upcoming week, especially when there's a lot of people messing around with some of the more interesting new stuff. You can play a degenerate old style deck and crush their dreams. Lastly, I'll point out Draven's biggest fan. A lot of people are eyeing this card probably. It's not a very, very competitive card in general. Usually there's kind of better slots, but I'm testing it out currently as a 1-of in this deck. It's doing pretty solid right now. Just like slightly improving your odds of having the Draven drop on 3 actually does noticeably increase the deck's win rate, because the difference between the 1 fan versus just like the normal 3 Draven is about an increase of like 10 or so net percent of odds of having Draven in hand by a relevant turn. Goes from about 60% to 70%, and that's a really, really big deal because Draven will be swinging your win rate in games. Anyway, moving right along, let's go ahead and check out Kinko elusives. Now, Kinko elusives is a deck that honestly I don't even know why I still like pull it up in this segment every week. This is a deck that literally just doesn't change. This deck is completely immune to change. You know what? I lied earlier when I said every single deck had at least one change. I forgot about elusives. I forgot that this is the one deck that actually had 0 changes this week. And the reason I forgot that is because Kinko elusives literally never really gets changes. Not really. I will say though, one minor thing about this deck compared to last week is that the Frenzied Skitterer nerf down to 2 health does actually allow for Zed to attack against it, which is actually a big deal. In olden times, it used to be Zed would come down, Skitterer sets Zed to 2 health, and Skitterer has Skitterer sets Zed to 2 attack, Skitterer has 3 health, so your Zed can't attack. No longer will that happen, and if you are an elusive player, you actually will know how commonly, like that wasn't like, it's not like it was happening every game, but that's a common position, and that's no longer gonna happen, so that feels great. But ultimately, this deck isn't really super different. The game plan of elusive, just like, you know, your units can't be blocked, you buff them up, you make them big, you send them into the opponent's face. That's it. It's just as easy as that. Now, Kinko elusives has come in this week at a 59% win rate, which is, hey, that's pretty good, right? Kinko elusives, I think like last week I ended up dipping it to the top of tier 2 just because for some reason it had a very low win rate that week. But Kinko elusives has maintained basically a 60% like, or almost 60% win rate for the last like month and a half plus. And with Bannerman getting nerfed a little bit, you know, Kinko elusives is getting a bit more of a share of the throne. That takes us to, of course, Bannerman. Bannerman is a deck that has basically passed the trial of time. It's gone through several different forms, but while I was prepping for a tournament, this is actually based off of a lineup that I saw similarly. I did make one tweak here, and if you're paying attention, you will notice it. We swapped out the House Spider for a Legion Drummer. I tend to really like this card as just an additional 2-drop. It's a really great follow-up to something like Fleet Feather Tracker, as well as, you know, giving you better value out of your challengers, those being like Laurent Protege and Fiora. The quick attack support does really a lot of work with the early developmental plays that you will be making with this deck, right? Giving like the quick attack combined with a challenger is going to do very well. Effectively, it functions as like some extra Bright Steel protectors, and except even sometimes a little bit better, because there's a lot of situations where you can keep it alive because of its support tag, you can keep it alive because challengers are keeping it alive, and the quick attack that you're combining with challengers can be reused like more than once, unlike Bright Steel Protector. Now, it also goes to say that the Vanguard Bannerman Allegiance value did get like very minorly decreased. Whiffing the allegiance does matter a tiny bit less, so there is like mathematically a little bit more of an edge to like getting in slightly in a little bit deeper in like more off-color cards, like more non-Demacia cards. We might see a little bit of experimentation with people running more like 3 or 4 non-Demacia cards. However, in this case, I think I doubt it, just because Demacia has so many tools you're going to want. Anyway, if you don't know Bannerman, it's a really easy deck. You play Tracker on 2, you play one of your, or sorry, I already messed up. You play Tracker on 1, you play one of your 2s on 2, you play Protege on 3, you know, Bannerman on 4, Bannerman on 5, you know, you're just good to go. It's very much a curved stone style deck. It's very basic, and it consistently performs every week, this week hitting kind of the same 59% win rate that we saw with elusives. Then, that brings us to Karma Ezreal. As mentioned earlier, it is a little bit down on its win rate in Masters this week, down to 58%. And the reason for that is just because it is kind of like a little bit more counterable than other decks. So when it does kind of rise in play rate, its win rate is going to drop a little bit more noticeably than a lot of other decks in proportion. Karma Ezreal being kind of like the quintessential combo deck of like Runeterra's archetypal triangles. This is kind of going to be cleaning up a lot of like control Shadow Isles decks, but losing to very aggressive decks like, you know, discard burn, or of course like spider aggro. This is a very, very polarizing deck. It has a high skill ceiling. It is likely something that they're going to be nerfing in the next balance patch, because both Ezreal and Karma were on this patch's watch list, but for now they are untouched, so this is a perfectly fine deck to play out. It's a good time to enjoy it while it still lasts, because yeah, this deck probably is on a lifetime. But yeah, if you don't know, basically this deck tries to stay alive until turn 10, where you just start blasting with Ezreal and Karma, sometimes in conjunction, some with just, you know, one or the other. Then that's going to take us to Burn Ezreal. Now, this is not old Nox Ezreal. This is a little bit different. This is a new concoction that I've been cooking up, and if you've been watching my streams, you'll have actually seen this in process. We brought it to the Jam Fest tournament, as well as we spent an entire day on ladder just like refining and tweaking it and figuring out how best to work this concept into the ladder. Now, I do want to say when I was experimenting on stream, I was running Augmented Experimenter over Progress Day. I still haven't decided which I like better, but Progress Day has been kind of like more tested, so it's what I include here. Now, the difference between this deck and older versions of Nox Ezreal is that we've added a couple of Boom Kurukis and Legion Grenadier. And to add those, we've removed some dedicated stall options, like for example, House Spider and Jury Rig. Now, the biggest thing about this is it provides this list much needed flexibility. This is no longer a committed all-in Ezreal deck. This is not like Ezreal Karma in that way. This is a deck that will be often burning your opponent's face down without flipping Ezreal at all. And between Boom Kuruki and even just a couple of Legion Grenadiers, you'd be surprised how easy it is to accomplish that with like your Get Exciteds, Mystic Shots to face, etc. So, or especially when Draven is kind of such a dominating presence and hard to block. So effectively, this is a version of Ezreal that's a lot more teched against some of the matchups that Ezreal has in the past struggled with. Take, for example, you know, Nox Ezreal matchup into Karma Ezreal. Normally, that's a really unfavored matchup because it's kind of hard to be flipping your Ezreal, but now with these modifications, this is probably, I would say, it's at least even. I would call it favored all of a sudden. The reason for that is because the ability to burn down your opponent, like play a lot more aggressively, stuff like Boom Kuruki that they can't really answer very effectively is always going to get in damage, and you can just start slinging your spells at their face and they will likely die before they make it to turn 10. The same is true, by the way, for Carina Control. Noxus Ezreal has never really had an answer against this deck, and it still has a decent amount of healing, so depending on how they draw, you might not be able to win, but it's significantly favored over versions that are relying on flipping their Ezreal, because as you know, if you play Nox Ezreal, this is not a matchup where you can flip Ezreal in. So the new version of Ezreal, this is Burn Ezreal, and I built this to basically be a lot more flexible. Now, it is harder to play. That's the trade-off. You will have to make judgment calls about whether to level your Ezreal or whether to just start burning your opponent's face off, and that's going to be a little difficult. That's going to be based on your matchup as well as your hand state. So being able to like be experienced with the deck and making that call, I would say, will be one of the requirements of this version of the deck moving forward. And then that goes ahead and brings us to a bit of a project of mine. This is my Noxus Yeti deck that you might have seen me build on my stream when the patch notes were revealed. Now, Yetis have been seeing some experimentation. I think Infinite Patrons was like messing around with Yetis, and I ended up like trying out my hand at a Yeti concept. I built 2 or 3 like rough Yeti decks, tweaked them around. I ended up trying a lot of different concepts, but one of the biggest changes in the patch notes was that Avaros and Trapper is going from a 2-2 to a 3-3, and it is hard to explain how massive this is. The difference between a 2-2 and a 3-3 is huge. A 2-2 in Runeterra is kind of almost a useless stat line in the current metagame. It dies to like Fleet Feather, it dies to Laurent Protege for free, it can't survive War Chefs or Elise, it does kind of nothing against anything. The 2 attack kills like almost nothing relevant right now. The 2 health keeps it out of like some vague removal ranges, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter because it only has 2 attack. But a 3/3, I tell you, it's a crazy change. Suddenly, this is blocking War Chefs. This is blocking Elise. This is surviving anything that deals 2. It's like an absolutely massive +1/+1 buff. I've never seen anything like it before. And what this will mean is we have the ability to run around with some Yetis. In addition to that, Carina and Draven and Kato the Arm all got their own buffs. So this is a deck that is using many buffed cards. Carina, of course, summoning an extra Blade's Edge the first time you play her, which just helps her ability to, you know, get a bit of removal in, and Kato going to 4 health, which is great and makes him a lot harder to remove. Now, the idea behind this deck is pretty straightforward. It's just a 5+ attack units deck, so we're running Trifarian Assessor to draw us cards and help our kind of snowball condition. We're running, you know, of course, just a bunch of 5 attack units, most of which being Yetis, and then we're running Reckoning to be able to sometimes kind of like control out the board and, you know, help smash a big opponent's board that can be going wide out of our control depending on the circumstance. We're using a lot of classic combos like Legion Drummer's Quick Attack with Trifarian Glory Seeker's Challenger, which is, you know, a really neat combo that usually Noxus Freljord versions are often playing for. And that's about it. A couple of Yeti synergy Tall Tales will sometimes be a 3-mana 5/5, which is nice, although you got to be careful to use it in a situation where it's a little bit less disruptible. And we've got Ancient Yeti. Now, Ancient Yeti, I gotta say, this is a card that has really impressed me. This is a card that I've been underrating for a while, and I think it's safe to say, like, the vast majority of ladder has been underrating this card for a while as well. It's, like, when you have it in your opening hand, it's absolutely insane. Even when you draw it in the late game, it doesn't feel bad at all. It's still a 5/5 overwhelm. You don't really care about high mana cost in the late game. Mana is an early game resource. So Ancient Yeti, when you play it on turn 4 as a 5/5 overwhelm, feels great. When you play it on turn 5 as a 3-mana 5/5 overwhelm, feels amazing. So Ancient Yeti is a card that definitely gets all kinds of places. Now, I've put this in tier 2 because honestly, I mean, it's a pretty new concept. There have been some people messing around with Yeti decks. Most I've seen have been built quite a bit differently. There's a lot that are playing for a smaller amount of Yeti synergy. Almost all of them, in fact, all of them that I've seen have been running Babbling Bjerg, which I've cut out from this list. I could see adding him back in, but I actually think that he's a little too slow for how this list wants to play, and he doesn't synergize with enough of your tools. You're usually going to be, you know, hitting the one Hearthguard that you need anyway, so I don't think it's going to be super necessary. But I put this list in tier 2 because I'm personally expecting it to end up with like a tier 2 win rate. I will be playing this on stream, like in like basically probably on the first day, almost, yeah, actually definitely on the first day of the patch, which is, I guess, today, you know, at time of broadcast. I don't know, it sounds weird to say, but anyway, basically I think this deck will have a pretty solid win rate. I would not be shocked if this became a new popular mid-range concept. Right? I'm not going to say I think it's going to be tier 1 or something like that. I'm certainly not going to say those words, but I do think this has a lot of potential. I'm happy to put it in tier 2 for now, and we'll see how it goes. That's going to go ahead and bring me to Spider Karma. Spider Karma this week, slightly kind of like on a stable win rate. They're currently at 56% win rate. We can see we're getting into slightly lower win rates here. And this is my current version of Spider Karma, or I guess Spooky Karma. It depends who you ask. But this version, you know, compared to more traditional Spooky Karmas, is playing a lot more kind of like mid-range tempo spiders with stuff like Elise. Now, I do actually think that this deck is starting to get edged out by refined versions of the Carina deck. Now that like the Carina deck has been being taken in directions where it is starting to cut more of its tools, like more of the things dragging it down, like for example, like too many 9-drops, too many stuff like Progress Day that weren't really like servicing the deck. I do think it is starting to outpace Spooky Karma in terms of end game finishers, so we'll see how that all works out, but it is very possible that Spooky Karma is actually gonna be a little bit on its way out as an archetype. Now, the biggest thing that's gonna decide that, by the way, are these two tools, Will of Ionia and Deny. And the reason that Ionia can never die is because it's very meta dependent, right? Some metas, Will of Ionia is extremely powerful, and some metas, Deny is very powerful. So in metas where you're going to want those tools, then this version is absolutely going to be better than the Piltover and Zon control version of Shadow Isles that, you know, happens during Carina. We call it a Carina deck. It's not even running 3 Carinas anymore. It's like, it just happens to use that card. But it's just PNZ Shadow Isles control with Laedra's finisher. And this version is pretty good, but it's starting to dip in win rate. We'll see how it ends up going long term as a deck, but this is not something that I have huge expectations for spiking in win rate next week. And that takes us to Burn, Discard, Aggro. Now, this is a pretty, obviously pretty fascinating list. This is my current version of Burn, Discard, Aggro with, Jinx Draven. It's just full aggro, rush at their face really, really fast. It's actually quite a deceptively difficult deck to play. You need to be very, very choosy about like when to be playing for Jinx, when to be flipping your Jinx and all that. And it's actually rocking a surprisingly high win rate this week at 59%, although a bit of a low sample size, so we can't necessarily read into that too much, especially because last week it was quite a bit lower. We'll see if it has staying power. So far it does look like Spiders is kind of like able to beat this, but one thing I will say about this archetype is I've been experimenting on stream with kind of like a slow play discard deck that is not really aggro. I'm running like maybe a couple of 1-drops, certainly not 9. And I actually think there's a ton of potential to that idea. It would look very different from this. I wouldn't be running like half of these cards, but it's just something I thought I would mention at this time. And that's a deck that I actually do have a prediction might end up in the tier 1 category in a week or two. We'll see if I can refine it to that point. Who knows? Anyway, it's a super fast burn deck. If you like the idea of just going full face, you're going to like the idea of just, all the direct damage this deck has to offer. We have Crimson Disciple as well as Transfusion, unlike some of the other versions of these similar concepts. That's going to basically, basically push face damage just a whole lot more, right? Now you might be wondering, how does this differ from Spider aggro? These are kind of the two aggro choices right now. Which aggro should I play? And I will say the biggest difference between these lists is Burn, Discard, Aggro is kind of like it's a bit slower, but the trade-off is that you're less reliant on board. So you tend to be better against board disruption tools like, for example, Withering Wail and I guess Avalanche as well, that kind of thing. As well as just the opponent owning the board in like a mid-range fashion like Demacia. Like this deck is pretty fine against Demacia overall. Like, unlike Spider aggro, which when you lose control of the board, you often lose control of the game, this deck will still be able to put them down to 10 health and still be able to kill them afterwards as long as they can't kill you very fast. And Demacia puts out some pressure, but if you can stall them just a little bit, they can't kill you fast enough before you can kill them. Okay, next up we have cloning bots. Oh yeah, I forgot about this one. So we're getting into the tier 3 decks here. As defined up here, we can see tier 3 is passable off-meta decks often hover around 50% win rate in Masters. Something like that. Sometimes a bit above 50, sometimes a bit below 50. There's nothing wrong with these decks. If you're a skillful player, you can climb 2 Masters with them. That's very possible. It will take you longer and you will have to be a skillful player, but these are not necessarily decks that I would recommend in general. But anyway, cloning bots. This is a deck that I'm actually going to be playing tomorrow as well on patch day, and it is very, 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 very similar to a deck that I built in the preview patches in like November. Like the first week when I played like the preview of this game, I wasn't using a lot of the barrier tools, and I wasn't using like LoR and Protege and Vanguard Redeemer, but it was almost all of the same cards. And I actually think with a couple of the buffs coming through here, most notably Shady Character, also, since then we've seen like Lux being touched up, I actually think this deck could be kind of at least fun, if not necessarily great. The idea here is basically on turn 3, you're double passing, and then on turn 3, you're doing one of two things. You're either doing Assembly Bot into Standalone, or you're doing maybe sometimes Remembrance depending on the hand. right? And when you assembly bot and when you stand alone, it's going to start getting really, really big. Sometimes you slap like a chain vest on it. If the opponent tries to remove it, you can usually protect it with any spell, because any spell will make it grow. And then you've got the ability to clone it with Shady Character. Now, I'll point out, Shady Character doesn't have to be used on assembly bot. If you don't draw assembly bot, you're perfectly happy using it on Remembrance, and you're going to have to make some spot decisions based on whether the opponent is running colors that have hard removal. But if they aren't really running like Ionia for Will of Ionia or Shadow Isles for Vengeance, you can even do stuff like Remembrance into Standalone into Shady Character and have two really, really large early dudes that can just take over the game, right? We're running Lux and Fiora, although I think there's a very good chance Heimerdinger could be correct here, as a lot of you guys would look at this list and immediately point out, and yeah, Heimerdinger, I could definitely see slotting him in the Fiora slot as well. Ultimately, I don't hate this list. I don't think it's terrible. It is a bit more of a slightly for fun deck than a super competitive deck, but it's not like a full meme deck. Like, I wouldn't put it in the Keck W category. You can still win plenty of games with a deck like that. I do want to point out with the, I guess while we're here, with the Shady Character buff, I think a lot of people are, like, don't get me wrong, I don't think this card is, like, nuts all of a sudden or anything like that. I'm not delusional. But I will say a lot of people are, if you don't know, Shady Character is at 3 health now when it comes out. And the reason for that is it's kind of harder to stop this effect from going off. It used to be before, you could play Shady Character, target something, and if they just kill it before the effect resolves, if they Vile Feast it, it dies and you lose your entire 4 mana card for no reason, right? Now it's a 1/3 before it transforms, which means if they want to stop the effect from transforming it, they have to deal 3 damage, which is quite a bit harder. I will say the biggest reason this matters is not because of the difficulty of removing it. It's not because of like, it's not because it's going to suddenly skyrocket into a super consistent, uncounterable card, but it's because when the opponent counters it, they will have to use a much more expensive answer, right? And that matters a lot. It's hard to explain how much that matters. Okay, let's say, let me give you a scenario. So I do a really big Remembrance on 3, you know, maybe I play like Standalone on it, and then on turn 5, I Shady Character my Remembrance Standalone. And the opponent literally cannot let that happen, so they have to waste their entire turn and use Grasp of the Undying or something. The Shadow Isles deal 3 for 5 mana. And that's really powerful. When I can force them to use, like, even if it gets destroyed, when I can force you to use something a lot more expensive to deal with it, something you really don't want to do, I'm still getting value out of my card. I don't mind that it's dying in those circumstances, and that's a large part of the value of the new Shady Character. Again, it still is a bit, you know, not necessarily a hyper competitive card, we will see, but the buff to it is probably a lot stronger than it might immediately seem. Okay, and that is it. Oh, wait. Oh, no, there's more. Oh, there's a Vlad deck. Oh, God. Why did I put a Vlad deck up here? Sorry, I edited this all, like, earlier today. I literally forgot I decided to put a Vlad deck up here. God damn it. It's just because you guys were telling me I needed to put more tier 3 decks on the site. So I was going through this earlier, and I was like, God, what's a tier 3 deck? And I was like, oh, I know. They love Vlad decks. I'll just shove a Vlad deck up here. And oh, Jesus. Well, okay. Like I said, as you can see from the description, Vlad is a deck that technically has a high enough win rate to call it tier 3. This is not, you know, again, it's not a Keck W deck. It's a tier 3 deck. It's not that bad, you know. Anyway, this is my version of Vlad, and basically the idea is you play this much more aggressive. Now, I'm going to be messing around with some similar stuff probably this week, and I might make a couple of tweaks to this, but it's been working pretty well for me. And basically the idea is this is kind of like an aggressive Vlad combo. We are using the new Kato the Arm and the new Draven, and we're playing a much more aggressive strategy than some other Vlad lists, right? We are gearing up to try to make one really, really big Scarthane Stefan, or, you know, just like buffed up veteran or something like that. And we're going to give it Overwhelm with either Kato or Might and just shove into them, basically, right? That's the game plan here, and it does quite well. I think it's a lot better than some of like the Braum lists, although of course it depends exactly like what you're looking for as a deck. They're gonna have very, very different tables, right? Like Braum is gonna be like kind of quintessential mid-range, whereas this is more of like an aggro combo, just like trying to burst the opponent down, and get a ton of surprise value out of a lethal that they just don't see coming, right? I think it's a very fun deck to play because you can do like a really hilarious combo for lethal with your tricks, right? Like, you know, you do an attack, your opponent submits a block, Oracle's Eye says they have like 10 health left, and then you just like out of nowhere, you just play like Take Heart into Transfusion, into Might, into Elixir of Iron, and then they're dead, right? And that's a very satisfying feeling. It's a fun deck to play. You can just surprise your opponents. Your opponents will probably think they're totally fine, and then just out of nowhere, they're dead. And that's great. And I love Draven's ability of hitting a deck like this. I have a raging hard-on for this card. I'm not gonna lie, like, it is true that I am actually Draven's biggest fan IRL. Like, I can't deny that. Draven, hey, he's just a good card. Draven just fucks. Like, what can I say, man? Like, he's just a really, really good card, and he will put out a little bit of early pressure on the opponent. They won't be able to block him, and he's a really, really good combo tool with stuff like Kato the Arm. When the opponent goes in for the inevitable removal on him, you've got Elixir and Transfusion in this kind of deck to keep him alive, so he will snap off value. Now, finally, oh god, there's one more. Oh yeah, I remember this. We were getting down into the depths. So this, I added a new Keck W deck. I will be playing this deck either tomorrow or the day after, on patch day or the day after. And it's a deck that I made, regrettably, on stream off of the Starlit Seer buff. Starlit Seer is now a 2-mana 2/3. And hey, honestly, it's not really going to help this kind of deck that much, but I do think that this concept is at the very least really hilarious. So I'll happily throw it up on the site as a Keck W deck, right? And if you can't tell just by looking at it, basically, you play a Starlit Seer, you play a bunch of spells to stay alive, and eventually you'll entreat or draw into a Tryndamere that will have upwards of 15 attack. In some games, he will have straight up 20 attack, and you can murder the opponent in like 1 or 2 hits. Now, Tryndamere is valuable because he's immune to cards like Vengeance, so he will be just kind of ending the game out on his own, which is really, really great. Now, you might ask, well, but Swim, what if a Starlit Seer buffs another Starlit Seer? Well, that's actually usually great for me, if anything. Like if I have a Starlit Seer and I'm buffing another Starlit Seer, I'll draw it in the next like 2 or 3 or 4 turns, and then when that happens, I'll have like, you know, a 6-7 Starlit Seer. I'll play it on the board. I'll have 2 Starlit Seers, and then I'll just keep plugging along until I draw my win condition, right? So don't get me wrong, I'm not defending this meme deck. Hey, it's a meme deck, but I'm just saying, like, it'll be really, really funny. I expect it to have some funny YouTube clips of me getting this combo off, and of course, you guys don't have to suffer as I will for the many hours of gameplay trying to make this combo work. Spoiler alert: when I do combos like this in YouTube, it's not the kind of thing that just works. You have to just grind for like 4 hours to try to get a dumb combo to work, just so you can get a stupid, like one game where it all finally comes together, even though obviously, you know, the deck is really, really not so good. And yeah, in all intents and purposes, just a meme deck. Anyway, that's it. That's basically the meta in a nutshell for next week. Now, obviously, this was slightly predictive. We don't know how big the nerfs are going to be. I personally hope that I'm wrong. I hope that Bannerman's nerf and like the -1/-1 that he gets to his body on the Allegiance slip, I hope that does relegate the deck to tier 2, because honestly, it is one of the decks that I think is, in my opinion, one of the least fun decks in the game, just because it's like super, super linear, very reminiscent of like some eras of Hearthstone, which is just like pure curve to me personally. So I don't find it super enjoyable. I hope that it's not still a tier 1 deck, but I do have to say, I think it will still have, like, you know, the tier 1 status. We will see. Anyway, that's it for me this week, and I'll go ahead and see you guys next Monday.